My wife left me for a millionaire. Then she learned I was worth 10 times more than him. The note was on the kitchen counter when I got home. Not a long note. Genevieve was never a person who used 10 words when 3 would accomplish the same result, which was one of the things I had loved about her for 14 years and one of the things that made the note, in its brevity, more devastating than a longer version would have been. It said, "I have made a decision. I am staying with Preston for a while. I think we both know this has been coming. The attorney's number is on the refrigerator. I am sorry." That was it. 38 words. 14 years. One yellow sticky note on a kitchen counter in our house in Brentwood, Tennessee, on a Tuesday evening in April when the dogwood trees in the backyard were doing what dogwood trees do in Tennessee in April, which is bloom with the absolute, indifferent abundance of things that do not require permission to be beautiful. I stood at the counter and read the note twice. Then I set my keys down beside it and looked out the kitchen window at the backyard and the dogwood trees and the garden I had been tending since we moved into the house 7 years ago, the raised beds along the south fence, the stone path I had laid myself over 2 weekends in the fall of 2019, the small wooden bench under the oak tree where I sat on Sunday mornings with coffee when the weather allowed, and where no one had ever joined me without being invited. I stood there for a while. Then I picked up my keys. I did not pick up the attorney's number from the refrigerator. I walked back through the house, past the living room with the furniture she had chosen and the books she had curated, and the photographs on the wall that were mostly of her and her colleagues, and one of the 2 of us at a benefit dinner in Nashville 3 years ago, where we were standing close together in the way that people stand when they want to look like a couple, and have been practicing the posture for long enough that it no longer requires effort, but no longer carries warmth either. I went to my study, I closed the door, I sat at my desk. I stayed there for 4 hours. My name is James Whitmore. I am 44 years old. I was born in Cookeville, Tennessee, the 3rd of 4 children of a woman named Bernadette, who taught piano lessons in our living room, and a man named Earl, who sold farm equipment across 4 counties, and who drove more miles in a year than most people drive in a decade, and who knew, from a lifetime of selling things to people who worked the land, that the value of anything could not be determined by looking at its surface. Earl Whitmore died in 2017. He was 68. He had a heart attack on a Tuesday afternoon in March while driving back from a sales call in Sparta. The truck rolled into a ditch on Route 70, and he was gone before anyone arrived. The state trooper told my mother it was peaceful. My mother told the state trooper she appreciated that and then asked whether she could have a moment alone, and the trooper said yes. And my mother stood beside the highway in the cold March air and looked at the truck in the ditch and did not cry. Not because she was not grieving, but because my mother, Bernadette Whitmore, was a woman who believed that grief was a private matter and that the road was no place for it. I am telling you about my father because he is the reason I understood something that most people do not understand until it is too late, which is that value and visibility are 2 entirely different things. Different. Earl could look at a piece of farm equipment that had been sitting in a field for 20 years, surface rusted and cosmetically destroyed, and tell you within 10% what it was worth mechanically. He could walk past a shiny new machine with a beautiful paint job and tell you within 5 minutes why it was going to fail. He saw what was there, not what was presented. I inherited that from him, and for most of my professional life it made me invisible. I met Genevieve in 2009 at a finance conference in Atlanta. She was 32 and worked in wealth management at a private bank. I was 30 and had been working for 3 years as a quantitative analyst at a small investment firm in Nashville called Birch Capital, where my job was to build the financial models that other people presented and to make the numbers legible in ways that allowed less mathematically fluent colleagues to walk into rooms and sound brilliant. I was good at this. Exceptionally good. I had a specific gift for finding the signal in the noise of large datasets, for seeing the structural truth underneath the surface behavior of markets, for building frameworks that held up not just under favorable conditions, but under the stress tests that separated real insight from optimism. No one at Birch Capital particularly cared about this. They cared about the results it produced and the relationships that converted those results into revenue. The results were mine. The relationships were not, which meant that the credit, reliably and without exception, went somewhere that was not my desk. Genevieve saw this about me immediately. It was one of the first things she said at dinner on the second night of the conference, after we had already had the kind of conversation that tells two people they are going to be significant to each other, even though neither of them is ready to say it yet. She said, "You are the person in the room who actually knows what is happening. You just do not seem to know that everyone else can tell." I said, "I think you are overestimating how much everyone else is paying attention." She said, "I think you are underestimating how much it matters." She was right. About that specific thing, she was completely right. She was not always right, but she was right about that. We married in 2010. 14 years of a life that I will not reduce to a summary because it was not a summary. It was mornings and arguments and dinners with friends and vacations that sometimes worked and sometimes did not, and the slow, particular intimacy of two people who know each other's habits and fears and the exact sound each other makes when they are happy versus when they are pretending to be happy. For the first 8 years, it was mostly good. She was ambitious in ways I admired. I was steady in ways she needed. We fit in the way that complementary things fit. Not identical, not frictionless, but functional and real, and built on a foundation of genuine respect. The last 6 years were a different architecture, not broken, not hostile, but gradually, year by year, reoriented around her trajectory in ways that displaced mine without either of us formally deciding that this was what was happening. Genevieve had left private banking and founded her own wealth management firm, Harlan Capital, in 2016. It grew quickly. By 2020, it had 12 advisors and $200 million in assets under management. By 2022, it was the largest woman-owned independent wealth management firm in Tennessee, and Genevieve had been profiled in 3 national publications and had given a TED Talk that had 4 million views and had been invited to serve on the board of a publicly traded financial services company. She was extraordinary. I need to say that and mean it. What she built was real and hard and rare. I was proud of her. I was genuinely, fully proud of her. But I had also, during those 6 years, become the person who was introduced at dinners as Genevieve's husband, who attended events primarily in the capacity of supporting cast, whose own work, which had quietly become something considerably more significant than his title at Birch Capital would suggest, was understood by almost no one in our social world, because our social world was organized around Genevieve's visibility, and my own work existed in a register of discretion that her world did not recognize as valuable. I had left Birch Capital in 2018 and started my own firm. Not a wealth management firm. A quantitative investment research firm. I called it Ridge Analytics. It had no website, no press, no LinkedIn profile worth examining. It had one employee, which was me, and a client list of 7 institutional investors who paid for access to my research and my modeling and my quarterly reports on market structure and systemic risk. None of Genevieve's friends knew about Ridge Analytics. Genevieve's colleagues knew I had left Birch but understood vaguely that I was doing some kind of independent research. Her mother, who called every Sunday and who had a habit of asking questions whose answer she had already decided, referred to my work as James's Little Project. James's Little Project, by the time Genevieve left, was generating $4.2 million annually in subscription revenue from 7 of the most sophisticated institutional investors in the country, all of whom had signed non-disclosure agreements that prevented them from disclosing their relationship with Ridge Analytics, and all of whom renewed their contracts every year without negotiation, because the research I produced was, by their own assessment, the best independent quantitative analysis available at any price. I had also, over the same 6 years, been quietly deploying the income from Ridge into a portfolio of investments that were exactly the kind of investments that a person who spent his professional life understanding market structure and systemic risk would make. Concentrated, patient, asymmetric. Long positions in undervalued companies with structural advantages that the market had not yet priced correctly. Short positions against businesses whose surface presentation exceeded their underlying economics by margins that were not sustainable. By April of the year Genevieve left, my investment portfolio had a value of approximately $68 million. I had told my attorney about this. I had told my accountant. I had told my mother. I had told Earl in the private, one-sided way that people talk to people who have died when they need to say something out loud to someone who will not repeat it. I had not told Genevieve. Not because I was hiding it, because she had never asked. In 6 years of building Ridge Analytics and building the investment portfolio, she had never once asked me what I was working on in specificity. She knew I did research. She knew I had clients. She understood at some level that it was going well. But the specifics, the actual numbers, the actual names, the actual scope of what I had built in the study behind the closed door, while she was on the phone with her board members and her media contacts and the organizers of the events at which she was the most interesting person in the room, those specifics had never been requested. You cannot offer what you are not asked for, and I had learned slowly and without bitterness that the most loving thing I could do with what I had built was protect it from the frame that would have been placed around it if I had introduced it into a world organized around my wife's visibility. Preston Holt. I should tell you about Preston Holt. He was 48, third-generation old money from a family that had made its first fortune in real estate in the 1920s and had spent the subsequent 100 years maintaining it with the practice skill of people who understand that preserving wealth is a different profession than creating it. He had a house in Belmead and a house on Kiowa Island, and a plane that flew between them, and a reputation as a philanthropist that was, by my assessment, about 40% genuine and 60% strategic, which is actually a better ratio than most people in his position achieve. He and Genevieve had met at a charity gala in Nashville in January. By February, according to what I would later learn from a conversation I did not intend to have but could not avoid, she had already decided something about her marriage that she had not yet said to me. She was at the gala for professional reasons. He was there because the gala was organized around a cause his family had endowed 20 years earlier. They were seated at the same table. He was charming in the way that men who have never had to earn anything are sometimes charming. Effortlessly, with the confidence of a person who has never seriously doubted their own desirability. He knew everyone. He introduced her to people she wanted to know. He followed up the next day with a text and a referral to a board position she had been trying to obtain for 2 years. I know this because she told me some of it in February, framed as a professional connection. I know more of it because people talk and Nashville is smaller than it appears. And a friend of mine who worked in real estate had seen them together at dinner in March and mentioned it in the particular, careful way that people mention things they believe you already know. I did not confront Genevieve about it. I want to be precise about why. Not because I was passive or afraid or uncertain, because I had made a decision that the most important thing I could do for both of us was give her the space to tell me the truth herself, and that if I forced the conversation prematurely, I would be making her choice for her, which was not something I was willing to do for someone I had loved for 14 years. She told me with the sticky note on the kitchen counter in April. The week after I found the note, I called Franklin Cross, my attorney, who had been helping me structure Ridge Analytics and the investment portfolio since 2019, and who was one of 7 people on Earth who knew the full financial picture. Franklin was 63, methodical, and had the particular equanimity of a man who had handled enough complicated situations to understand that the most useful thing he could offer a client in a crisis was not alarm, but clarity. I told him what had happened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I will have a full disclosure document prepared within 2 weeks. I want a forensic accountant to run a current valuation on the portfolio before we produce anything. And James, I want you to hear something clearly." He paused. "You are about to walk into a process that people on the other side of are going to enter believing they have a significant advantage. They are going to be wrong about that. The question I want you sitting with right now is not how to win. It is what kind of person you want to be on the other side of this." I told him I understood the question. He said, "Good. Think about it carefully, because the answer will determine everything about how we proceed." I thought about it for 3 days. I sat in my study and I looked at the numbers and I thought about Earl and about the truck in the ditch on Route 70, and about the difference between a machine that looks valuable and a machine that is valuable, and about 14 years of a marriage that had been real even in its failure, and about a woman who had left me for a man who was worth, by any financial measure I could construct, considerably less than I was. On the 3rd day, I called Franklin back. I told him what kind of person I wanted to be. He said, I know, I was expecting that. I have already started drafting accordingly. Let me tell you about Preston Holt's finances, because this is the part of the story that the people who knew Genevieve and who saw her leave, and who watched her move into Preston's house in Belmead with the assumption that she had traded up, this is the part those people did not know. Preston Holt was worth, depending on how you counted the debt against the assets, somewhere between $8 and $12 million. The family real estate portfolio, which was the foundation of the family reputation, had been significantly leveraged over the previous decade. 2 major commercial properties in Nashville had declined substantially in value due to changes in the retail and office markets that Preston had not adequately anticipated. The Kiowa Island house had a mortgage against it. The plane was leased. He was not broke. He was not in danger. He was a man of comfortable, inherited, partially encumbered wealth who projected the confidence of dynastic success without its full backing. He was, in the precise and technical sense my father would have recognized immediately, a machine with a good paint job. I know these details because institutional investors in my network had positions in several of his family's commercial real estate vehicles, and because the research I conducted for my clients required me to understand the capital structures of a wide range of assets across the Nashville market, and because Preston Holt's family office was not particularly careful about disclosure in contexts where they believed they were among friends. I was not particularly among his friends, but his friends sometimes talked to my clients, and my clients talked to me. I am not telling you this to be unkind about Preston. I am telling you this because it is relevant to understanding what happened when Genevieve's attorney contacted Franklin in May with the initial asset disclosure and proposed settlement framework. The asset disclosure they submitted on Genevieve's behalf was built on the same assumption that everyone in our world operated on: that I was a former quantitative analyst who had left a firm to do independent research, that my income was modest, that the marital estate consisted primarily of the Brentwood house, which was worth $1.2 million with equity of approximately $600,000, our joint savings and investment accounts, which held approximately $340,000, and my retirement accounts, which held another $220,000. Total marital estate, by their assessment, approximately $1.1 million. They proposed an even split, $550,000 each after costs. Franklin received their disclosure on a Friday. He called me on Friday afternoon. I could hear him unwrapping something on his end of the line. He had a bowl of hard candies on his desk that he worked through steadily during stressful calls. Their number is 1.1 million, he said. I said, I know what our number is. He said, yes. Are you ready for me to send it? I said yes. He sent it the following Tuesday. The complete Ridge Analytics financial summary. The investment portfolio valuation, conducted by a forensic accountant who had spent 3 weeks verifying every position. The client contracts, redacted to protect confidentiality agreements, but showing contract values and renewal history. The revenue history for Ridge Analytics from 2018 through the current date. The total picture. Marital estate by accurate count, approximately $72 million, including the investment portfolio, the Ridge Analytics business valuation, the Brentwood house, and the joint accounts. $72 million against their $1.1 million. Franklin told me later that Genevieve's attorney had called him 40 minutes after receiving the document and had used, in sequence, the words impossible, incorrect, and then a pause long enough that Franklin had checked to make sure the call had not dropped. He said the attorney then said, "We are going to need some time." Franklin said, "Of course. Take all the time you need." Then he called me and said, "They are going to need some time?" I said I expected that. He said, "Are you sure about the terms you want to propose?" I said I was sure. Because this is the part I need to tell you carefully, because it is the part that people get wrong when they hear stories like this one. They assume the revelation is the ending. They assume that the moment the other side learns the full number, the story becomes about leverage and victory and the satisfaction of being seen as larger than you were believed to be. But I had thought about Earl and the truck on Route 70 for 3 days. I had thought about 14 years. I had thought about what Franklin asked me. What kind of person do you want to be on the other side of this? And the answer I had arrived at was not the answer of a man who wanted to win. It was the answer of a man who wanted to be finished. Finished with the performance of smallness. Finished with the invisible life. Finished with the careful maintenance of a frame other people had built around him, but not finished in a way that destroyed someone he had genuinely loved. My proposed settlement terms were straightforward. The Brentwood house would be sold and proceeds split evenly. The joint accounts would be split evenly. The retirement accounts would be handled according to standard QDRO procedures. Ridge Analytics and the investment portfolio were separate property under Tennessee law, having been built primarily from assets and income predating the marriage structure that Genevieve's attorney had now had to dramatically revise their understanding of. I was not asking for anything beyond what was legally mine, and I was not extracting anything from her beyond what the law required. Franklin had told me I could do significantly better than this in litigation. I told him I knew. He told me the other side would be expecting me to try. I told him that was their expectation and not my intention. He said, "James, she left you a note on a kitchen counter." I said, "I know what she did. I know who she went to. And I know what I am worth. Not because of the number, because of the work, because of the years, because of Earl Whitmore teaching me to look at what is actually there instead of what is being presented. I am not going to spend 18 months in litigation making her understand a number when she could have understood the person if she had just looked." Franklin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are a better man than most of my clients." I said, "I am just a man who knows what he built, and I do not need her to confirm it." The mediation was scheduled for a morning in June, a law office in downtown Nashville on Church Street, with the particular hushed, carpeted quality of spaces designed to make conflict feel managed. Conference room on the 3rd floor, mahogany table, water in a pitcher, 6 glasses. The particular neutrality of a room that has held 1,000 difficult conversations and absorbed all of them without comment. I arrived early. Dark jacket, no tie. My father's watch on my left wrist. The watch was a Seiko that Earl had worn for 20 years, and that kept perfect time, and that was worth perhaps $200, and that I would not have traded for any watch in any store in Nashville. Franklin arrived 2 minutes after me and sat beside me with his briefcase and his bowl of hard candies, from which he immediately offered me one. I declined. He took one himself. We sat in the quiet room and waited. Genevieve arrived with her attorney, a woman named Karen Pratt, who was sharp and efficient and had clearly spent the week since receiving our disclosure document preparing for a conversation that her original strategy had not anticipated. She sat across from me and opened a folder and did not look at me for the first 3 minutes, which told me she had been coached on how to manage her demeanor and was implementing the coaching with some effort. Genevieve sat beside her. She was wearing a blazer I recognized, navy, structured, the one she wore when she needed the armor of professional composure. Her hair was the way she wore it for important meetings. She looked exactly like the woman I had married and exactly like someone I did not currently know. She looked at me. I looked at her. We held the look for a moment that was long enough to be honest and short enough to be manageable. Then we both looked at the table. Karen Pratt opened the mediation by acknowledging the updated financial disclosure and expressing her client's desire to reach a fair resolution. She said the word fair with the careful emphasis of someone who has been asked to use it and is not entirely sure it still means what it used to mean in this context. Franklin thanked her. He outlined our proposed terms. He presented them the way he presented everything, precisely, without theater, with the clean economy of a man who knew the numbers were doing the work and did not need his voice to add drama. Karen and Genevieve conferred in low voices. I watched the wall. Then Genevieve said, "I did not know." Her voice was not quite steady, not quite unsteady. The voice of a woman holding herself at the precise tension point between professional composure and the thing underneath it. Karen Pratt put one hand briefly on Genevieve's arm, a small professional gesture of containment. Genevieve said it again. To me. Directly. "I did not know, James." I looked at her. I said, "I know you did not." She said, "Ridge Analytics, the portfolio, all of it." I had no idea. I said no. You did not. A pause. The room held it. She said, "Why did you not tell me?" And there it was. The question that had been building since April, since the sticky note, since the gala in January and the dinner in February and the friend who mentioned seeing them together in March. The question that was about the money, and not about the money at all. I said I tried to tell you, not the numbers, but the work. I tried to explain what Ridge was building. I tried to show you the research. 3 years ago, do you remember, I showed you the quarterly report I had written for one of my largest clients. You were on your way to a board dinner and you said, "That is great, sweetheart," and you left. She looked at the table. I said 2 years ago I told you that I had taken a position in a company that I believed was systematically undervalued by the market. I told you I thought it would return 4 to 5 times in 3 years. You said that sounds like something your father would say. You meant it as a compliment. The company returned 6 times in 22 months. I did not tell you because by that point I understood that the space in which I was doing my most important work was not a space you were visiting. She pressed her lips together. Her eyes were dry but requiring effort to keep that way. I said, "I am not saying this to hurt you. I am saying it because you asked why I did not tell you. And the honest answer is that I tried. And the space was not there. The space in our marriage was organized around what you were building and what you were achieving and who you were becoming. And that was real and it was important and I was proud of you. But somewhere in those years, the space for what I was building disappeared. Not because you took it, because neither of us made sure it stayed. The room was very quiet. Karen Pratt made a small notation on her pad. Franklin unwrapped a candy very quietly. Genevieve looked up at me. She said, "Is this why you did not fight harder when I left? You found the note and you did not call me and you did not come to find me and you did not do any of the things I expected you to do. Is this why?" I said, "I did not fight harder because I had already decided that the most honest thing I could do was let you make your choice freely. You had made it. I was not going to perform a rescue of a marriage if you had decided the marriage was finished." She said, "And Preston?" I said, "What about Preston?" She was quiet. Then she said, "He is not what I thought he was." I looked at her. I said, "I know." She looked at me sharply. I know what I said, and I meant it literally. I said, "I know what his portfolio looks like. I know the capital structure of the Belmead property. I know the lease on the plane and the mortgage on Kiowa Island and the write-down on the Midtown commercial assets. I know because I do this work. I know things about financial structures that most people do not know because it is my profession, and because Nashville is a market I have been studying for 6 years." She absorbed that, the full, quiet, disorienting weight of sitting across from a man she had lived with for 14 years, and discovering that the entire time she had been looking at the surface of him, the reliable and unglamorous surface of a man who did research and kept his study door closed and tended a garden in the backyard. The entire time underneath that surface, there had been a depth she had never measured and a capacity she had never tested, and a worth she had never asked about clearly enough to receive an honest answer. I said, "I want to be direct with you about something, Genevieve. Not in this process. About us." She said, "All right." I said, "I loved you for 14 years. Genuinely. Without performance and without reservation and without keeping score. I was proud of what you built. I showed up to every event and every dinner and everything that mattered to you in the city, and I showed up as your husband and I meant it every time. What I needed from you was simple. I needed you to occasionally walk through the study door. Not to understand every number, not to follow every trade, just to be curious, just to ask, just to see me in the work the way I saw you in yours." She was not successful at keeping her eyes dry. I said, "I do not think you are a bad person. I think you are a person who got very good at one way of seeing the world and stopped checking whether there were other ways to look. I think Preston looked like a different kind of seeing, and he was not. I think you are going to figure that out, and I think you already have, based on what you just said about him not being what you thought he was." She said, "What do I do with all of this?" I said, "That is not mine to answer. She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I am going to sign the papers your attorney is about to propose, which I have already reviewed and accepted, and I am going to go home and sit in the garden and drink coffee and think about what comes next. And then I am going to build the next thing. Because that is what I do. That is what I have always done, whether anyone was watching or not." The mediation concluded 40 minutes later. The terms we had proposed were accepted with one modification: a slightly larger share of the Brentwood equity for Genevieve, which I had already built into my expectations and which I had signaled to Franklin before the meeting I was prepared to offer. We signed. The room exhaled. Karen Pratt shook Franklin's hand. Franklin offered her a hard candy. She accepted it, which I noted as evidence that she was a reasonable person. Genevieve and I stood up at the same time. The room was being cleared around us by the quiet efficiency of people moving on to the next appointment. We were the last two standing at the table. She said, "James." I said yes. She said, "I am sorry. Not for leaving. I think leaving was the honest thing, even if the way I did it was not. I am sorry for not seeing you. I am sorry it took all of this for me to understand that I was looking past someone extraordinary every single day of 14 years. I stood with that. I let it land. I let it be exactly as true and exactly as late as it was. I said, "I appreciate that. I mean it." She said, "Do you think you will be all right?" I said, "I have been all right this whole time. I just was not visible about it." She smiled. The first real smile I had seen from her in perhaps a year. The smile that remembered itself, that came from the place where Genevieve Harlan, before all the profile pieces and the board positions and the TED Talk, lived. The woman who had told a man at a conference that he was the only person in the room who actually knew what was happening and that everyone else could tell. She walked out. I stood at the table for one more moment. I picked up my father's watch and looked at it, though I was not checking the time. I was just holding it. The weight of it. The simple, honest, unglamorous weight of a thing that worked perfectly and told the truth and never asked anyone to notice. Then I walked out into a June afternoon in Nashville, warm and bright and smelling of the particular combination of flowers and humidity that is the city's signature in early summer, and I stood on the sidewalk and let the sun hit my face for a moment. I called my mother from the car. She answered on the first ring. Bernadette Whitmore always answered on the first ring because she said life was too short to make the people you love wait to hear your voice. "It is done," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How do you feel?" I said, "Like myself." I said, "I feel like myself, Mom." She said, "Good. That is the right answer. Your father would say the same." I said, "I know." She said, "Are you coming for Sunday dinner?" I said yes. I said I would bring wine, and she said she had wine and I should bring tomatoes from the garden if I had any. I said I had plenty. She said, "Good. Drive safe." I sat in the car for a moment after I hung up. I looked at the steering wheel. I thought about what came next, not with anxiety, with the particular, clean, forward-looking clarity of a person who has just set down something heavy and is standing up straight for the first time in a while and feeling the full height of themselves. Ridge Analytics had a research cycle beginning the following month. 2 of my 7 clients had indicated they were ready to discuss expanded engagements. There was a company in the healthcare technology space that I had been watching for 8 months, and that was approaching the valuation point at which I would take a position if the structural indicators continued to confirm what I believed they were saying. There was a market condition developing in commercial real estate that my models had been flagging for 3 quarters and that I needed to write up cleanly for the quarterly report. There was work, real, important, quietly significant work that no one would see, and that would matter anyway. I drove home to Brentwood. I parked in the driveway of a house that was technically still ours for another 60 days, and that would then belong to a market that would discover, as markets tend to, that it was worth more than it appeared. I went to the backyard. I sat on the bench under the oak tree. The dogwood bloom had passed and the trees were in their summer configuration, full and green and less dramatic than April but more permanent, the sustainable version of beauty, rather than the spectacular one. I sat there for a long time. I drank coffee that had gone slightly cold. I looked at the raised beds and the stone path and the garden that I had built over 7 years of Sunday mornings, while the world was organized around other things. Everything was still there. Everything I had built was still there. That was the thing about building quietly. It did not require witnesses to hold its shape. It did not need applause to maintain its structure. It simply was. Patient and solid and exactly what it was, regardless of whether anyone was in the garden to see it. I want to speak to you now. I want to speak to the person who is listening to this and who recognizes something in it. Not necessarily the specifics. The feeling of it. The feeling of being the person in the room who actually knows what is happening and who has learned, over years, not to say it too loudly, because the room was not organized around your voice. The person who builds the stone path while the world is looking somewhere else. The person whose study door is closed not because they are hiding, but because the work requires a door that closes. The person whose worth has never been disputed, never been adequately measured, never been asked about directly enough to require a complete answer. I want to tell you something that took me 44 years and 14 years and a sticky note on a kitchen counter to understand completely. The invisibility was never the problem. The invisibility was the condition under which real things get built, real understanding gets developed, real patience gets practiced. Real worth accumulates quietly and without fanfare in the hours when no one is counting. The problem was not being invisible. The problem was believing, in some part of you that you tried to talk yourself out of but never fully did, that the invisibility meant something about your value. That because the room was not looking, the thing you were building was not real. It was real. It is real. Everything you have built in the quiet hours is real. And here is what I know about real things. They do not require anyone's recognition to continue being real. They hold their shape in the dark. They maintain their value while everyone else is looking somewhere more interesting. They sit on a bench under an oak tree in a garden in June and wait for the world to catch up. The world always catches up, not always in the way you expected, not always with the apology you deserved, not always cleanly or gently or on a timeline that feels fair. But the math is the math. The work is the work. And the value you have built, quietly, patiently, in the room where no one was watching does not disappear because no one was watching. It accumulates, it earns, it waits. And one day, in a conference room, or a mediator's office, or a garden in June, or a moment so ordinary you almost miss it, someone will look at you and see the full size of what was always there. And you will not need to say a word, because the work will have already said everything that mattered. You are not a man or a woman who makes a modest salary at a respectable job. You are not James's little project. You are not the supporting cast in someone else's visibility. You are the person who actually knows what is happening in the room. You are the person who built the stone path. You are the person who sat under the oak tree and drank coffee on Sunday mornings and kept building regardless of whether anyone joined you on the bench. You are worth more than anyone who stopped looking at you ever realized. Not because the number says so, because the work says so, because the quiet hours say so, because the thing you built in the dark, that still stands in the light, says so. Tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight. Sit in the room where your real work lives. The study, the garage, the kitchen table where the spreadsheet lives, the garden where the thing you made is still growing. Sit there for 1 minute. Do not explain it to anyone. Do not justify it. Do not measure it against what someone else would have seen if they had bothered to look. Just look at it yourself. And know, with the same certainty you use to know the sunrise is coming, that it is real, that you made it, that it is worth every hour you spent on it in the room where no one was watching. That is your worth, not what anyone assigned you, not what the room assumed, not what the sticky note implied or the dinner conversation dismissed or the 14 years of organized invisibility suggested. Your worth is what you built, and what you built is still standing. That has always been enough. It just took the world a moment to catch up. It always does.